Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
We're going to do a little number for you, but remember we're a bit rusty, so bear with us.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, joined by Chad Gross, and today we're looking forward to an interview with Tyson James, the Global Director of Reasonable Faith Chapters. So, Chad, what's in store for us today?
Yeah, so we reached out to Tyson because he works with William Lane Craig's ministry, Reasonable Faith, which I'm sure many of our listeners are very familiar with. And Tyson is in charge of the Reasonable Faith chapters, and he's in charge of these global chapters that are in churches. And basically, as far as I understand, these are designed to bring apologetic content to the church. And I wanted to talk to him about how does somebody start one of these, maybe some of the things that hold people back from starting one of these. For example, if they're nervous about, I don't really know a lot about apologetics or something like that, what do they have to do in order to start one of these? And so I just thought it would be useful. And also I wanted to promote them because I love the idea of having apologetic classes throughout the world, honestly, equipping Christians to be able to communicate their faith in a thoughtful and winsome way.
Yeah, Reasonable Faith chapters are something I dig. Ran the Reasonable Faith Belfast chapter for quite a while. I would love to see more of these pop up, and looking forward to talking to Tyson James. He's earned MAs in International Relations and Christian Apologetics, having operated as the Global Chapter Director and Director of Translations and Transcriptions for Reasonable Faith since 2017. He now seeks to employ his knowledge and experience to build the fields of Christian philosophy, theology, and apologetics. He's a veteran of the U.S. Air Force and currently lives in Las Vegas, Nevada, with his wife, daughter, and son. So let's go to our interview with Tyson James.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Tyson James, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to finally meet you.
Indeed.
So for our listeners, tell us a bit about yourself and your journey becoming a Christian and what keeps you busy.
I grew up in a Christian home. My dad was actually a convert from Buddhism because he was from Laos. He and my mom got married, and she was a devout Christian from a Christian background. And so really it was kind of that situation, flirt to convert. So, he wanted to marry her and had to learn what Christianity was and decided to become a Christian. And then they got married. So I grew up in a Christian home. My dad actually was ordained to be a pastor, even though he didn't go on to be a pastor. So learning the Bible, praying, doing devotions together was a big part of our home life. I grew up in Arkansas, which is the Bible Belt. So, went to church a couple times a week and went to Awana and, learned really from an early age what Christianity teaches. Like most people, though, I didn't learn why Christianity was true, and that wasn't really taught in the church. And so graduated high school, went to college, stopped going to church as much, joined the military, lived a very hedonistic lifestyle for a while. And really it was during a deployment to the Middle East where I was kind of separated from my worldly influences. I was kind of focusing on the mission out there, and a captain on a flight crew, he handed me a book, and it was called One Thing You Can't Do in Heaven. And it's all about the one thing you can't do in heaven is evangelize. So the book was all about why right now is the time to evangelize. And this guy, he included some rudimentary apologetics in this book. And I had never seen these even remotely rudimentary arguments. Super basic, but it resonated with me. And he had cited Lee Strobel's Case for Christ, the book. And I got that. And of course, Dr. William Lane Craig is interviewed in that book on the evidence for the resurrection. And I was just absolutely stunned, blown away. And I thought to myself, this is amazing. This is something I want to pursue. And so I bought Reasonable Faith by Dr. William Lane Craig and just fell down a rabbit hole of studying apologetics and theology and philosophy for the next several years. Got out of the military, studied apologetics at Biola University, got a master's degree in it, started a Reasonable Faith chapter in 2013, and then was invited to be the global chapters director for Reasonable Faith in 2017, and have been doing work with Reasonable Faith ever since. And then about a year and a half ago, I started my own Christian consulting firm called Sound Faith Consulting. So basically building the areas of Christian philosophy, theology, and apologetics by offering assistance to Christian scholars and speakers.
Oh, wow. So the main reason we wanted to have you on today, Tyson, was to talk about something you mentioned there, the Reasonable Faith chapters. And so can you talk to our listeners about what is a Reasonable Faith chapter and what's kind of the idea behind these chapters?
Yeah, so if you envision like a church small group, but one that focuses on studying the reasons why Christianity is true and answering objections to Christianity. So basically fulfilling the mission of Reasonable Faith at the local level, in person, in small groups. That's basically what the Reasonable Faith chapters are.
Okay. So if somebody is listening right now and they're thinking, that sounds like something I'd like to do, how would one go about starting one of these Reasonable Faith chapters?
Yeah, the process to become a Reasonable Faith chapter director is pretty simple. You have to be certified through our certification process, and there's only a couple steps. First, you submit an application online. You just go to reasonablefaith.org and click on chapters, and there's a chapter application there. You affirm the theological distinctives. So we want to make sure that everybody is on board with, what is the gospel, right? What are the essentials of Christianity that we agree on? But of course, Dr. Craig, he kind of operates on a mere Christianity model. So we actually have a very eclectic group of chapter directors. We have Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, so, a wide range of chapter directors. You complete the chapter application, and then the next step is to read the Reasonable Faith book, the 3rd edition, and complete the study guide. So I send all applicants a digital copy of the Reasonable Faith study guide for them to complete. And then once you complete the study guide, you send it to me for review. Then you submit contact information for 2 references. One should be a pastor or other ministry leader of a church that you've attended in the last 5 years. And then finally, just a brief testimonial, 1 to 2 pages of, how you came to Christ and what your walk with him looks like today. And that's really it. Once those things are completed, you are certified to open a Reasonable Faith chapter to represent the ministry in your local area. You also receive a lot of promotional materials straight from us that the ministry provides for free, such as free books and things with the Reasonable Faith logo on it so that people know that you're formally associated with the ministry.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, what are the, what merch do you get? Because that's important.
Oh, yeah.
The merch.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
So I'll list some of it off. So you get a tablecloth, which is actually, tablecloths are like, $100 here in America. So that's pretty good. Reasonable Faith pens. So really nice, comfort, like cushy gripped pens with the Reasonable Faith logo on them. A polo shirt with the Reasonable Faith logo on it, which actually, I've got this thing here. This is like a little sweater here because I'm special. But there's the logo embroidered on there, but you would get a polo shirt with the Reasonable Faith logo. Copies of the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology and the 2nd edition of Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Your chapter gets put up on the website with its own landing page. You get an official Reasonable Faith email. You get access to a private Facebook group. You get access to a Google Drive where all of our chapter directors share teaching materials and social media graphics and articles and books and tons and tons of stuff to help you kind of hit the ground running.
Excellent. Nice kickbacks. Brian, were you going to say something?
No, well, I was kind of thinking, man, I started the Reasonable Faith Belfast chapter, but that was like when they first started, like maybe it was the 2nd chapter. And we didn't get any of that.
I know.
We had to go into the jungle with machetes and pave the way. No,
Brian's like, where's my stuff, man? No, I was going to say, one of the reasons why we have all that stuff is because of those early chapters. When I took over the chapters, I noticed that there was a lot of burnout because each chapter was just kind of an island having to create their own materials, and there was very little communication. I was just like, man, everybody having to start from scratch, creating every lesson over, over and over again. Over the years, you're just going to get burned out. So being able to share materials, being able to take something that's already created and just edit it a little bit for your own chapter, that's been a huge benefit and time saver. Plus,
Yeah.
the ministry dedicating a lot of money to these other materials that I mentioned, huge support. I mean, I've got to credit the board for having the vision for, putting that money forward, because there are very few organizations out there doing that.
That's a great point, because when I first started, it was like a meeting every 2 weeks, but that burns you out quick. And then once a month was good, but I couldn't do that all year. So it would take a few months off, maybe nine months of the year we would do it, and for about 9 years. I did get to the point where I was like, life situations changing, church situations changing, location we can have the meeting is changing, and it was like, well, I think I've taught about everything, and so the support, it would be helpful in that regard.
So you did talk about how the group of the people who lead these chapters is pretty eclectic. I was wondering, can you give us a layout as far as, and I don't even know how much expectation your ministry has for these chapters in regard to my questions, but do you dictate kind of how should the meetings look? Do the chapter directors have a lot of freedom? Do they have to stick with William Lane Craig's materials, or are they allowed to supplement with other materials?
That's a really good question. We actually are not micromanagers. Our chapters run semi-autonomously, which basically means that the chapter director has a ton of flexibility in how their chapter looks and what they teach. And we do that intentionally because the people that attend their chapters are going to be different than the people that attend any other chapters. So we want to give them the flexibility to use their discernment with the guiding of the Holy Spirit to attend to the needs of their specific group composition. So, some groups, they're ready for advanced philosophical arguments. Other groups have to start with basic Christian theology, right? And if we were to dictate their direction and what they have to cover, we would not be meeting the needs of those two different groups. So we really give the chapter directors a lot of leeway. They also decide when, where, and how often to meet. So you don't have to meet in a church, even though there's kind of a built-in group. A lot of chapters meet in churches, but some chapters, they decide, hey, we want to reach out more to unbelievers and have a safe place for skeptics to come and ask questions and just have conversations. So we want a more neutral location. So maybe they'll meet in a coffee shop or a library or a restaurant, a community center, something like that. What's interesting is we had a chapter application from a guy in the US Navy, and he actually wanted to open a chapter on a submarine. And we were definitely going to let him do that. He just had to get through the certification process, but he never completed it. But I thought that would have been so cool to have a chapter on a submarine.
Yeah, that would have been a great story to tell. Man.
But yeah, so there's no limitation on where you can meet. You don't have to use only Dr. Craig's material. In fact, if you read through the Reasonable Faith book, he's citing dozens and dozens of scholars all over the place.
That's a great point.
So, our chapter directors are more than welcome to use all of the great material that's out there. We trust that they're discerning enough to know what sources are good and what aren't. We also, and this is important to note, we also don't require that our chapter directors agree with Dr. Craig on every single thing that he teaches, right? Mm-hmm. We're all coming from different theological backgrounds. We all have, some differences with Dr. Craig on various things. And that's perfectly fine. And that's why we have the theological distinctives as they are, the mere Christianity model, because we want to be unified on the essentials and then have some flexibility in exploring those secondary issues. So we just ask our chapter directors, if you're teaching on a section where you disagree with Dr. Craig, just do the charitable thing, teach accurately what his view is, and then caveat your disagreement by saying, this isn't Dr. Craig's view or the official view of Reasonable Faith. This is where I differ, and here's my view. And that's perfectly fine. That's the way that should be handled. And that's That's what we want our chapters to be, is open places for communication of various views.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I find it very encouraging that it's not heavy-handed as far as, what the meetings have to look like and what materials you have to use, as long as they go along with those theological distinctives, which makes sense. So what would you say to somebody who's listening right now and they're thinking, wow, this sounds great. I really want to do this, but they're hesitant to start a chapter because they're thinking, I'm not an apologetics expert. I don't have an education in this. How would you encourage them?
So I would say that the vast majority of our chapter directors do not have a background in formally studying apologetics. So you've got people coming from high school educated, but also, having doctorates in unrelated subjects. And everybody in between, professionals, doctors, lawyers, people working in the computer industries, just people from many, many different backgrounds. So no matter what your background is, as long as you can get through the certification process, you can be a chapter director. Also, age is not an issue. I've had some teenagers come up to me and they're like, hey, I want to be a chapter director, but I feel like I'm too young. I'm like, we don't have an age restriction. So again, as long as you can get through the certification process, you can be a chapter director. That's really just the bottom line. Is we have our requirements for certification. As long as you meet those, you are more than welcome to represent Reasonable Faith by running a chapter.
Okay. Yeah, and I imagine the younger people could maybe attract people that maybe older people would not, and vice versa. So that I could see an advantage there. Would it be safe to say, Tyson, that if somebody was able to complete the study guide, that would, I realize it's not a complete education, but wouldn't that do something to prepare them to be able to lead the class? Would that be?
Yes, people that complete the Reasonable Faith study guide are actually overqualified in some respects to teach these lessons, because in an actual chapter setting, you're usually not going to go as deep into the weeds of the arguments as they are presented in the Reasonable Faith book. That's a graduate level text, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to be operating more at a high school undergrad level in a chapter context. But going through the Reasonable Faith book and study guide prepares you for, I would say, 95+% of what you need to relate in a chapter context, minus some things on the problem of evil and religious pluralism and things like that. But if you just go through maybe On Guard, which is the more basic version of Reasonable Faith, with some additional chapters, that covers those topics.
Yeah, I know that I told you I'm kicking around the idea of doing a Reasonable Faith chapter, maybe one of the other options that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And I have completed some of the study guide. I think I've done 4 sections of it. And I know that On Guard, I used both. I was using both the Reasonable Faith third edition and On Guard. So one kind of supplements the other nicely. So that's a great. Yeah. There's a friend of mine who has a Reasonable Faith chapter, and he's having trouble getting people to attend. I told him that I would ask you this kind of on his behalf. How would you speak to somebody who is in that position of they're really having their head down and they're trying to plow and get things going, and it's just not happening? Any suggestions or recommendations there?
Yes. So 2 things. On one side, even if you're only meeting with 1 or 2 people, don't discount the impact that can have. It may seem frustrating, but 1 or 2 people trained under you who then go out and influence a lot of people can have a multiplying effect that is incomprehensible. I go back to the story of Charles Spurgeon. The way he became the Prince of Preachers basically was he was walking along in the rain, wanted to get out of the rain, hopped into a little chapel where a young preacher was preaching to less than a handful of people. He sits down and hears this beautiful sermon that was, basically speaking directly to his heart. And he decides, I need to preach the gospel. And then he becomes Charles Spurgeon, right? He's one of the most well-known preachers ever. So just, the faithfulness of that preacher to preach to a handful of people has influenced the entire world, right?
Wow.
So don't discount what you're doing at your local chapter, even if it's just a couple of people. It can be frustrating, but God is using your faithfulness for sure. So that's one side.
That's encouraging.
On the other side, on the other side, if you're wanting to increase the number of people going to your chapter, there are a few different things you can do. And it's largely a marketing thing. Number one, you can change the format. If you're just doing a book study, you're going to get maybe a handful of people who are loyal, committed to reading the book and going through it. But you're not going to get a room full of people doing that, right? In order to get more people, you're going to have to change the format so it's not so time consuming, right? Time commitments are tough for people these days. Everybody's busy. So maybe do something like a short run, like a multi-class series on a particular topic, like maybe 3 or 4 weeks on a particular topic. I did this in Monterey, California when I was running a chapter there on Islam. And this was not too long after the outbreak of the war in the Middle East. Global war on terror was still going. Let's just put it that way. So Islam was still a major topic. It was only a 4-week run, but the room that I had was packed out. It was the most people I'd ever had coming to my chapter meetings. So changing the format, talking about something that people are interested in, that will get them through the door and more interested and more committed because they're not having to commit so much time. Also, I would just say talk to your church leadership, because if they're not bought into what you're doing, it's going to be very hard to get your congregation to also buy in. So having your church leadership passionate about what you're doing, sending people your way, is going to increase your numbers and the awareness among your congregation and even community around you. Also, I always encourage our chapter directors, because their certification qualifies them and trains them in ways that almost nobody in their communities has that type of training, right? So it's a shame to kind of hide it under a bushel and just keep it for a small group of people at your local church. We want this information to go out to the entire community. So reach out to other churches, reach out to Christian schools or Christian businesses to see if they would help facilitate and sponsor events, because that's another way that you're going to be able to share this information with more people. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there and do some cold calls. Ask some pastors out to lunch and give them a vision for having a church environment in your community that is on board with apologetics.
That was really helpful. Have any of your chapter directors had any success advertising kind of online via social media and things like that? Is that something else that is helpful, or is it more helpful to go that kind of grassroots local approach that you kind of just described?
Yeah, so we do both and encourage both. There have been some chapters that have had enormous success putting on events and advertising on social media. So, for example, the Denver chapter it was like a Biola Apologetics conference, and they advertised it on social media. They invited a lot of students to attend, and it was just a huge attendance turnout. So we utilize all of the different modalities to do outreach. A lot of our chapters create their own Facebook pages and do a lot of outreach that way. So we live in a time where you have to be literate in online marketing.
So Tyson, I know that there are some other ministries that have something. I hope this is okay to say, but it's something like Reasonable Faith chapters. For example, Reasons to Believe, Hugh Ross. Of course, there's the Stand to Reason Outposts, Greg Kokel's ministry. And so I was wondering, what if someone's listening and they're thinking, well, I know that there's those options available too, and I'm not trying to pit you against them at all, but I'd like to ask, how is Reasonable Faith unique among those? And then how would you advise somebody to decide between which one would be best for them to pursue?
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that, because we want people involved in apologetics at any level, right? This is information that needs to get into the church, that needs to get into the communities. And if you are hesitant about partnering with Reasonable Faith, there are other options, and we desperately want you to partner with somebody in participating in sharing this information. So, like you said, there's Stand to Reason with their outposts, Reasons to Believe, Ratio Christi, which they do campus ministry. There's also Grassroots Apologetics for Parents, which is kind of like almost the most basic level. So if you're intimidated by, high level philosophical arguments and apologetics, maybe go check out Grassroots Apologetics for Parents, which, I mean, they basically give you, here's what you can say word for word almost during your chapter meetings. So there's a place for everyone to fit in. Different ministries have different focuses, and it's kind of like any other parachurch organizations, right? A lot of different organizations have different focuses, and you just have to find where you're called. Reasonable Faith has a particular sort of flavor to it, right? When you think of Reasonable Faith, you think very polished, delving into the philosophical terms and very concise and things like that. Not so much dealing with political issues or hot button cultural topics, right? But if that's where you want to go, then maybe you want to join up with Stand to Reason and their outposts, which they're, constantly talking about cultural hot button issues. Or if you're more science oriented and want to focus on empirical data, maybe Reasons to Believe is your cup of tea. So, like I said, there's just so many options out there, and we want everybody out there to be involved in the work of apologetics on the ground in some capacity.
How many total chapters do you have the date of this recording in October 2023? I know they're in the States, but where can people find them internationally as well?
We have almost 250 chapters in 39 different countries, 6 continents. We're missing Antarctica, so that's one that I'm working on right now. So if you have any contacts in Antarctica, just let me know.
I just happen to be moving there next week, so.
Hey, okay. Well, finish up your certification, man. Get a move on. Yeah, we're all over the place. And in fact, when I took over the chapters in 2017, it's interesting. We had a few international chapters, but we had 0 chapters in Latin America. So one of the first things I did was I said, I got all the chapter directors together and I said, hey, let's pray that God opens doors in Latin America. And within the first year, I think we had like 10 chapters in Latin America open up. And it's just blown up since then. We actually had to hire regional chapter director for Latin America because we were adding so many chapters there. So that's Raul Jaramillo, who is also my business partner at Sound Faith Consulting now. It's just blown up, and we've added so many chapters in the US that we've had to break it up into regions and promote regional chapter directors in the US. So it's just amazing what God is doing. We have a chapter in Kathmandu, Nepal. One of the great stories that comes out of the chapters program, actually. He went and shared the gospel to a nomadic tribe in Nepal, just a couple of hundred people in this tribe, and they had never been evangelized before. He goes out, he's taking pictures with these people, and he's got his Reasonable Faith logo shirt on, evangelizing to this tribe. I think it's called the Rauta people in Nepal. Just incredible. Yeah, so God is taking the gospel through these chapters all over the world.
Well, that's awesome.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, we were going to ask, about some testimonies and stories, but that was the goose bumper for me. So,
yes.
that
yeah,
was cool.
I know, right? I don't know that. I mean, unless there's a better one, that's a pretty darn good way to,
Do you have any better stories?
There's so many stories.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story that came out of one of the chapters that I was running. So I was in Monterey, California, and one day I was preparing a lesson to give a lesson on the fine-tuning argument. And I get in there and my laptop is just not hooking up right. The PowerPoint's not working. I'm like, Lord, what is going on? Somebody comes up to me and says, hey, this lady who, she normally attends, she's not going to be here today. Her father died. I said, oh man, okay. Also, we had for the few weeks previous to that, we had this atheist guy attending our chapter. Even though we were meeting in a church, I had advertised on Craigslist, and he had started coming because his wife had died of some disease, and so he really was just looking for connection, and he loved to talk about religion. So, he was joining our chapter for just some community and discussion. So I said, okay, this is interesting. So I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with all this. So the lady, like 10 seconds after I was told that she wouldn't be attending because her father died, she comes walking through the door and joins the chapter that day. And I said, okay, God, my PowerPoint isn't working. I've got this atheist guy whose wife died of a terrible disease. I've got this lady who's a Christian whose father just died, and she decided to come to this chapter meeting. I was like, I'm getting some really strong signals here that I'm supposed to do something with this. So I just impromptu said, okay, guys, my PowerPoint isn't working, and here's the situation. Let's circle up all the chairs and have a discussion. I said, I would like to hear from this atheist guy and this Christian lady how they are handling the suffering of the loss of a loved one from their particular perspectives. And so they did. And by the end of it, there's just crying and hugging on the atheist guy, and just a real world example of apologetics in practice, showing how, and what's interesting was the Christian lady, she said, I'm sad, but I have hope. I'm going to see my father again because I know he loved the Lord and accepted him as his savior. And the atheist guy, he had in his talk, he said, I don't think I will ever see my wife again. I had my time with her and that's it. And I'm just broken. And it was so sad, like that's really what everybody was crying about at the end, was because of the lack of hope. But yeah, that was another poignant episode that just came out of God using the chapter to, in a real world way, bring these issues into practical application.
Wow.
Wow, that's powerful. Well, Tyson, we want to thank you for coming on the podcast, for sharing a bit about yourself and these chapters. It sounds like such great work being done, and so encouraged that over 200 of these all over the planet. So I'm sure there's people that are listening who want to know more, where they can find one or how they might start one. Well, of course, we've talked about that, but can you direct people online where they can go to find out more? Of course, we'll link to it in the show notes, but talk a little bit about where they can find that.
Yeah. So like you said, we have almost 250. We're actually aiming for 1,000. So, we've got plenty of room. Everybody can go ahead and fill out the online application today. But to do that, you just go to reasonablefaith.org. Right at the top there's a tab that says chapters. You just click on that and it'll take you to the application where you can get the process started.
Great. Well, thanks so much and really appreciate your work.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you guys. You're doing great work too.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.